and welcome to NCST's Community Impact Briefing. As we've not met in the past several weeks, we're happy to see so many of you back with us and hope you've been able to take some kind of vacation as this strange summer comes to an end. We have a lot to catch up on this week and look forward to your input about how things are changing in your markets. As a reminder, all lines are currently muted. To ask a question or provide feedback during the call, please use either the Q&A, chat sections, or raise your hand and we'll be happy to unmute your line. To get us started this morning, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, David Sanchez from NCST, who will provide you with key information about upcoming Middle Neighborhoods calls of interest. Over to you, David.
Great, thanks, Erin. So just before we begin, I'll just mention two upcoming webinars from the Middle Neighborhoods Community of Practice. The first one is going to be focused on community engagement strategies during COVID-19. That webinar is going to be taking place Tuesday, September 22nd at 1 p.m. And it's going to focus on practical ways to engage communities during the pandemic. We're going to be soon announcing the panelists who are going to share their strategies and success stories. And we're also going to brainstorm together and demonstrate a number of different formats for that practitioners can use to build virtual connections between middle neighborhood businesses, partners, and community members. The second webinar is Black Middle Neighborhoods in Legacy Cities, Part 2, which has been rescheduled from the end of last month to Thursday, October 1st at 12 p.m. Following up on Part 1, this webinar is going to talk about not only the history of Black neighborhoods in America, but Alan Malice is going to be joined by Kamala Lewis of Shaker Heights, Ohio, and Jonette Richardson from Neighborhood Housing Services of Baltimore, and they're going to discuss strategies for the stabilization and revival of Black middle neighborhoods. Just as a reminder, before each Middle Neighborhoods webinar, we offer a Middle Neighborhoods 101 presentation, which is a way for new members to learn more about the initiative and to meet our Community of Practice Coordinator, Marcia Nedland. You can register or learn more at middleneighborhoods.org. Thanks very much, and we hope to see you guys on the webinars.
Super, thanks, David. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to our president, Julia Gordon, to introduce our guest speaker for today.
Great, thanks so much, Erin. We are absolutely delighted with being able to attract today's speaker to join us. Daren Blomquist is the Vice President of Market Economics at auction.com. So he spends his days thinking about the same things we all spend our days thinking about. He analyzes and forecasts both macro and microeconomic data trends to provide value to both buyers and sellers on the auction.com platform. And I know that folks in the policy space really look to his work as well. His reports and analyses have been cited by thousands of media outlets. He's frequently quoted, appears, on lots of TV programs. So we are very honored that he's able to join us today. But before I turn things over to him, I want to tell you that our relationship with auction.com is about to move from just one of admiration of some of their work to a real potential partnership. We are going to be piloting a new program with auction.com where we will be receiving second look properties, which you're familiar with from some of our other programs, with the hope to expand to some kind of first look offerings in the future. And one particularly exciting feature of this program is that buyers will be able to provide bids on properties as opposed to simply accepting the pricing provided by the seller. That's something lots of you have talked about for many, many years with us. And we just, couldn't be more excited that auction.com shares some of our vision in this area. And then if this bid pilot does prove successful, we could potentially expand it to additional sellers. So, again, Daren is not just someone we look to for information, but now, coming into the NCST family as a partner, and I'm going to turn things over to him now.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction, and it's great to hopefully be joining forces we are joining forces with this pilot program and continuing to do that. And, you know, we're really thinking more and more about the priorities that you guys have been prioritizing for many years around neighborhood stabilization. And we understand we are coming to understand the importance of that. So I'm learning from you guys, and I've talked to a few of you over the past few weeks, and it's been a great learning experience to just understand what you're doing in your communities. Ian in Youngstown, Chris in Cleveland, and Jeff in New Jersey and other places. So it's been a good learning experience for myself, and so it's been great. I do have some slides to share with you today on some of the things I'm looking at, and I do think they align with probably some of what you all are concerned about. And so I'm going to, basically there's 3 sections here, and I know I have a limited amount of time, and also want to make sure I leave time for questions if there are any questions. But there are 3 major things I'm going to talk about. The first is just some general macroeconomic and housing trends, and we'll go through that pretty quickly. I think it's probably what a lot of you are seeing already and know about to a certain extent. And then we'll look at, although my theme for that part is housing is on a little bit of a sugar high right now, riding a bit of a sugar high. And then we'll get into the second section, which is shadow supply. I believe there's shadow supply behind that sugar high that is impacting this market, or will impact this market down the road even more so than it is now. And then finally look at we'll pull back the curtain a little bit on some of what we've been doing internally in terms of forecasting what the specifically foreclosure volume is going to look like over the next few years. And also pull in there's been some other forecasts that have been publicly published out there, and compare that to what we're thinking as well. So to get started, the first slide there, yeah, thank you, Mariah, is housing market riding a sugar high. This is a great indicator of demand. Is purchase applications for mortgages have just, after a dip there following the declaration of the pandemic in middle March, we have seen now 13, I think this is a little bit outdated. I think now we've seen 14 consecutive, and that should say weeks, not months, with a year-over-year increase in these mortgage purchase applications. People want to buy homes, and they're applying for mortgages to buy homes in greater numbers than they were a year ago. The next slide shows that this demand is translating into actual sales. And this is, that top graph there is home sales, existing home sales from the National Association of Realtors. One of the clearest V-shaped graphs that you'll see, and most people are saying, yes, housing is undergoing, at least at this point, a V-shaped recovery. When you see a graph like this, where we did see a dip in existing home sales, but they have recovered strongly in the last couple of months. And in July, we saw a 25% month-over-month increase in existing home sales, and that was the biggest on record. And we're now not just up from the previous month, but up from a year ago. Price appreciation is accelerating after slowing down there for a couple of months, and we're seeing that home prices are going up at a new all-time high ever. So we're exceeding the previous peak. And home ownership. Now, there is some skepticism around this report from the Census Bureau on the left-hand side, but because they had to change some of their survey methods because of the pandemic. And so some people are doubting this huge spike we're seeing in the home ownership rate in the second quarter of 2020. But we were trending in that direction. As you can see in the lighter blue, homeownership rate had been coming back and recovering, but then you see this almost unbelievable spike in the second quarter. And there may be some that may be exaggerated, but the point is homeownership rates are coming back. Homeownership has become more desirable for many people. That's continuing a trend of millennials aging, but it's also, I think, accelerated by the pandemic. And you see the under 35 group on the right there had the biggest increase in homeownership rate. And then we also see on the distress side of things, on the next slide, that as strong as we see demand for retail homes, we're seeing in our marketplace on auction.com, strengthening demand from primarily real estate investors who are buying off of our platform for distressed property. They have not shied away too much from this volatile market or the volatile economy. And so a couple of ways of kind of comparing our demand to retail demand are the number of multiple offers or bidding wars from Redfin versus number of properties we have with multiple bidders. We're at 85% with multiple bidders versus 49% in the retail market. The graph on the right is a little bit outdated now because home prices on the retail market have come back now. But back in June, the average price on our marketplace, the appreciation was exceeding the retail market. Another of the big macroeconomic trends on the next slide that you've probably heard a lot about and may be especially relevant to this group is this storyline, this narrative we're hearing about this demand leaving urban areas and more toward the suburbs and rural areas. And there's definitely some evidence of that when we look at the data on the left-hand side. This is looking at public record data from Atom Data Solutions and pairing it up with Census Bureau classifications of rural to urban or city. And you do see the large cities have a pretty low appreciation in the second quarter, home price appreciation. And this is by zip code, aggregating up zip codes. Whereas actually mid-sized cities have the strongest appreciation. And then you see rural fringe areas, which are areas that are within 5 miles of an urban area, but or an urbanized area. Those are seeing strong appreciation. And we see that on our platform as well. We see the city properties in cities with the sales rate is actually declined for our online REO auctions from a year ago. Whereas in the suburbs and rural areas, we're seeing the sales rate, which is the percentage of these properties that are available that actually end up selling. Those are increasing in the rural and suburban areas. Our foreclosure auctions up across the board, but the suburbs are seeing the strongest increase in sales rate. That the caveat there is because of the foreclosure moratorium, there are that's a small number of foreclosure auctions that are happening just on the vacant or abandoned properties, and on those gray bars there. And then that trend, I believe, is that we're seeing this rural versus urban trend is somewhat tied to and accelerating a trend we were already seeing. It's not exactly aligned, but even in 2019, we were seeing this population migration away from some of the larger cities on the coast, not all cities, but places like California, New York and Illinois had the biggest population net migration losses in 2019, and even at the county level, we see that places like Los Angeles, Brooklyn, Queens County, Cook County, Illinois, and on the flip side, biggest net migration increases were in more of those suburban type areas, Maricopa County, Arizona, Phoenix, which is Phoenix, and then Nevada, Las Vegas, Nevada, Dallas area, and Austin area of Texas. So those are some of the macro trends we're keeping an eye on. And then I did want to now focus on the shadow supply that we see coming down the road. So, I mean, my thesis is that the housing market is looking better than it really is right now, because of some of the stimulus and the holding back of some of the distress, which has been a good thing for the economy and the marketplace. But it is making things look better than they actually are to a certain extent. And so we want to be careful when we're assessing the market, not to assume that we're just going to keep on doing as well as we have in the housing market. So one of the things I look at foreclosures in this slide as the thesis here is foreclosures are actually one source of supply that are somewhat comparable to new homes, because in many cases a property that goes through foreclosure was not available to retail buyers and renters for an extended period of time prior to the foreclosure. And then once it's been foreclosed on, there is at least the opportunity for that property to be rehabbed and made available to the retail market. And so if we compare these, if you buy into that thesis, you can compare foreclosure sales to new home completions, single family homes completed. And we see that that historically speaking, going all the way back to 2000, foreclosure sales represented 34% of those two supply sources combined. During the last recession, we saw home builders pull back, foreclosures accelerate, so foreclosures represented a bigger source of supply. Not surprisingly, during a good economy, that those foreclosure sales have represented a smaller source of supply. And now in 2020, which isn't on the graph, we're seeing basically foreclosures representing 0% of supply almost. And if you go to the next chart, you do see, this is data from our platform showing the number of foreclosure sales that were happening on our platform this year versus last year by week. And the foreclosure moratoria are having their desired effect. We are seeing very few of these foreclosure sales actually happening. And again, we would argue that's a good thing for the housing market, given the unprecedented nature of this crisis, to not allow this flood of foreclosures to happen as a result of this blindsided, the economy being blindsided by the pandemic. But it also is holding back supply that was happening in a good economy without any pandemic. There is a certain amount of supply that's happening coming from the foreclosure market, and that has been cut off, basically. We're seeing a slight increase in some of that inventory, but we're still at, even in the most recent data, we're still seeing only 18% of our pre-pandemic average in terms of the volume of foreclosure sales that are happening. And we would estimate, looking at public record data, our platform represents about 50% of all foreclosure sales that are happening in the country. And then this heat map, and by the way, this is happy to make this presentation available. Some of these heat maps I have in here are interactive, so you can go in and see. This is just at the state level, so just showing where we see foreclosure sales coming back a bit more than others. And so places like Arizona and Alabama, we see it does depend on some of the local rules and the county rules as to where we're seeing some of these foreclosures come back. And again, it's only going to be on the vacant or abandoned properties that are exempt from the moratoria that are happening in these areas. And And then, so another behind the shadow supply, we have foreclosures that have been cut off, and that the longer the moratoria go, the bigger that shadow supply builds up. And then even behind that shadow supply, you have delinquencies, and we're seeing 90-day delinquencies starting to increase, 90+ day delinquencies starting to increase. This is data from Black Knight, and the red bars there are the 90-day delinquencies. We're at about 2.25 million according to them as of July, and that is up by 1.8 million from 4 months ago in March. And so that number has exploded. And what stands out to me is they actually look at the ratio of 90-day delinquencies to foreclosure inventory. Because of the foreclosure moratoria, the foreclosure inventory is actually decreasing slightly, basically staying flat, while these 90-day delinquencies are spiking. So now you've prevented that foreclosure blindside that happened in the last downturn, but you still have that distress building up in the 90-day delinquency, the seriously delinquency bucket. And that ratio is 12 to 1, 12 borrowers who are seriously delinquent for every one in foreclosure. And historically that ratio has been 2 to 1. So the big question is what's going to happen with that big backlog in the 90 days, even though they haven't gone to foreclosure at this point. And then a concern for us in terms of shadow inventory, even going into this pandemic, actually we released a report back, I think it was in February, basically saying we expected an uptick in FHA foreclosure volume this year because of some of the trends we were seeing in our data, the inflow, and due to the fact that FHA loans had been kind of the riskiest mortgage in town over the last few years. And so there was increasing layers of risk built into those loans that made them more susceptible to default. And the pandemic has only really revealed the weakness in the FHA loans. And I don't want to overstate that and say that FHA is this overly risky loan type. It just was in a very strong underwriting environment. It was a riskier mortgage type. But we're now seeing that is the most susceptible, with the 16% delinquency rates, according to the Mortgage Bankers Association, which is the highest they've ever seen, going back to 1979 in their survey. Back in the last recession, FHA delinquencies were at 14%, so we're above that. And so we are seeing that bear out. And I'm going to spend a few slides here on the FHA. The next one is looking at the seriously delinquent, the 90-day plus. That's also at the highest level they've ever seen. Now that data only goes back to 2004, but still exceeding the last downturn, the Great Recession. And certainly that's not the case for conventional, and overall the loan pool we're not seeing exceeding the Great Recession, but for FHA specifically we are. And the concern with FHA loan goes beyond just the fact that they were more risky loans because of the lower credit scores and the higher debt to income ratios we were seeing there. But also the next slide shows that the other weakness in the FHA loans that's important, especially in this environment, I think, is home equity. So on average, a purchase FHA loan is at 96% LTV, meaning basically 4% equity built in when the person buys the home. And the majority of active FHA loans right now were originated in the past 4 years, meaning people who bought in the past 4 years using an FHA loan have probably, some of them, but some of them have built up enough equity to have what we call tappable equity, or what Black Knight calls tappable equity, that would really be a nice cushion against a shock, economic shock. But many of them are not going to have that sufficient equity. And you know, that's been an argument that's out there in the marketplace. Well, this foreclosure crisis is not going to be as bad, and I agree with that statement in general. But one of the arguments is that there's so much home equity in this market. But when you look at the FHA segment of the market, that's one area where that's not as true as other parts of the marketplace. And yeah, credit's not, this is probably a bit of a no-brainer, but there's a large percentage of FHA loans that would fall in the technical category because of the credit scores, and those tend to have the higher delinquency rates that we're seeing now on those lower credit scores. So that's that. And then we also are seeing, even though the GSE, the conventional loans, have not been as impacted as FHA, we're certainly seeing a huge amount of forbearance or on loans that are conventional loans, Fannie and Freddie. We're seeing more go into forbearance so far through May of 2020 than we did for all of the last 3 years combined. So there's, again, that big pool that's somewhat similar to the seriously delinquent pool that I talked about earlier. Is, yes, these folks are not going into foreclosure, which is a good thing. We're not just having that knee-jerk reaction and allowing that foreclosure to flow through, but there is a lot of distress kind of behind the scenes in this housing market that will need to be worked through in some way over the next few years. And then the next slide looks at overall forbearance. This is data from Black Knight, and the theme here is that we have been seeing a downward trend in forbearance, which is a good thing. But the other side of that coin is also that kind of theme with FHA and VA being the most problematic, where we're actually seeing increases in forbearance, the loans in forbearance in that segment. And I have a quote here from the MBA chief economist, and he actually had another quote in this week's report that basically FHA borrowers are being disproportionately impacted by this pandemic, and that's showing up in the forbearance numbers as they continue to, as they've been increasing counter to the overall trend with conventional loans and other loans that have, actually the other loans, other categories, mostly privately owned portfolios, those are up as well. And the MBA actually attributes the majority of that to buybacks that these lenders are doing of Ginnie, May, or FHA loans. So it still ties back to those FHA loans. And then this I find very interesting is so there's forbearance numbers are going down, which is a good sign. But if then you dig into why people are leaving forbearance, why borrowers are getting out of forbearance, it's a pretty interesting picture, I think. And this is an average. This is from the MBA, but an average of the last 13 weeks of their survey of why people are leaving forbearance. And so I did a little exercise of saying, well, let's say these percentages hold true for the entire 5 million loans overall that have gone into forbearance. And if we look at that, we end up with about 3.5 million borrowers getting out of forbearance because they become current and they're paying their mortgage. So that's the biggest chunk of this, which is a really good sign. But the two kind of more risky categories are the 1.1 million borrowers approximately who would go into some sort of loss mitigation, loan modification, or payment plan after the end of forbearance, after they exit forbearance. And we're seeing that's about 22% of all forbearance exits so far. But then there's this really troubling category of 6.3% of borrowers who are leaving forbearance, but not entering into any sort of loss mitigation, but they continue to be delinquent or in default. And it may be that these are folks who were already in trouble before the pandemic and are just kind of returning down that path. I don't know. There could be a lot of speculation around that, but there is this chunk of folks who took advantage of forbearance and then are leaving forbearance, but not really leaving the path toward foreclosure. All right, so last section here is just a look into our crystal ball and some other crystal balls about what we think this will mean over the next few years. And of course, this is not set in stone. We can't say this is guaranteed, but this is our best guess using math to figure out what's going to be happening, math and kind of our tribal knowledge of how the foreclosure market works. But if you look at the next slide there, Mariah, it's kind of a summary, and maybe you guys can, if we share the slide, or I'm happy to share the slides and you come back and read through this. There's a lot of detail here, but probably the next few slides will show this a little bit more clearly. So here's our forecast. And on the left is actual foreclosure volume. And we define foreclosure volume as properties brought to foreclosure auction. And that could happen in one of two ways. Either the property is sold to a third-party buyer or it goes back to the bank. So you see the big spike there during the Great Recession. And then basically we're going down to nothing in 2020. And then we do see a slow ramp up, but because of these forbearance programs and the moratoria, we don't see the peak in this cycle happening until actually 2024, which is a few years out, obviously. And but we end up 199% above the pre-pandemic level, but still 39% below the Great Recession peak on a quarterly level. And then if you take, it's a shorter time frame too than the Great Recession impact. And so you see overall, we end up at about 50% of the volume over the entire 3 to 4 year period where we expect elevated foreclosure levels. You end up at a little bit less than 50% of the total volume during the years of the Great Recession. So, but we see, on an annual basis, we would say that 2021 is actually going to be lower than 2019. It won't be till 2022 until we see volumes above the 2019 levels. And then at the peak, we're getting back to about 2013 levels before declining again. Now, some other folks have released distressed market forecasts, and so I just wanted to compare here. This is Atom Data Solutions. I used to work there, full disclosure, but they're looking at foreclosure filings, which are more of the pre-foreclosure notices as opposed to the actual completed foreclosures, which is what we're looking at. But in any case, they only go out to 2021, so it's a much more limited scope here. But in 2021, they're calling for about 336,000 filings, which is 112% above the pre-pandemic level, still 68% below Great Recession levels. The next slide is First American. This is just their historical chart. They don't have a comprehensive forward-looking chart, but they use actually their methodology aligns most closely with ours, which takes into account both unemployment rates as well as home equity, which is an important kind of counter to foreclosure if folks have home equity. But in any case, they are showing somewhat similar, and they're also not taking into account timing. They're saying, based on the unemployment rate that we saw in the second quarter of 2020, how much, for that one quarter, how much foreclosure volume would be produced based on the historical relationship between unemployment and home equity and foreclosures. And they're saying, based on that, for that one quarter, 167,000 properties would go to foreclosure auction. They don't try to say when that will happen, but that would end up being about 178% above the pre-pandemic levels, but still similar to our forecast, 39% below the Great Recession peak there with their numbers. And then finally, CoreLogic, and they're looking at delinquencies, not at foreclosures, but they are calling for seriously delinquent rate to quadruple by the end of 2021, which would end up resulting in about 3 million homeowners that are seriously delinquent. And that's up 400% from the pre-pandemic level, but still 38% below the Great Recession peak. So that's what I got. I know I just threw a lot of data at you, but hopefully it was helpful, and happy to share the slides, Mariah, with whoever is interested if they want to look through that in more detail, and open to any questions that you all have.
Thank you so much, Daren. It's certainly can be said that many of these numbers are just staggering. And so we really appreciate the time that you put into this presentation. We will absolutely make it available on our resources page. And I do see that we already have a hand raised, so I will go ahead and unmute you. Kevin Moody, are you there? And it looks like you still might be muted on your end.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good afternoon. Kevin Moody of KCEE. Daren, thank you very much for your presentation. Just a couple quick rapid fire questions. Do we happen to know when the pilot program is going to begin with NCST and how it would work is my first question.
I don't know the exact timing. We just kind of confirmed it with my boss this morning. And so, but it's certainly something that's near the top of our list.
Okay, well, I will be very excited to be on the lookout for that information. And the second question, could you very, very briefly elaborate on how auction.com works, what the fees typically are, what's the marketing period in the event that we have any properties that we might want to go that direction? And thank you in advance.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for asking. So the question about auction.com, how auction.com works, I don't know if you've ever visited the site, but the primary inventory on there right now are the bank-owned online REO auctions. And those oftentimes do have a buyer's premium, not always a buyer's premium associated with it, that I believe is around 5%. So that would be I guess the fees that you're asking about. And but it is an online bidding platform, so there are auction events where you are bidding against other bidders out there.
Thank you for that, Daren. A question in the Q&A from David Dannenfelser. How much impact do you think Fed or Treasury MRB purchases are having on market conditions?
Yeah, certainly I would say that is a huge part of the sugar high that the housing market is on right now, is the stimulus that's flowing into the economy and the housing market specifically in the form of the Fed's actions, as well as that affect the purchases of mortgage-backed securities, as well as the low mortgage rates that we're seeing right now. And then the other kind of side of that is really impacting, I think, the housing market is the pulling back of the distress, which is as I've talked about, keeping things looking really good right now.
Wonderful. Any additional questions about the data that Daren has presented for us this morning? I know it was a lot of information. You may need some time to digest.
Well, if I'm allowed to ask a question.
Yes, absolutely.
So on the slide, there are a couple of different delinquency slides, but there was one slide where I was curious whether it was what I'll call real delinquencies versus forbearances. And I would have to go back through the deck. It was like the first delinquency slide, the one where about the 2-to-1 ratio going to a 12-to-1 ratio.
Yeah, so that one, I mean, I would call those, I guess, real delinquencies. That's not forbearance per se. Those are, now some of those are in forbearance. The way, that's data from Black Knight. And so the way they look at it is they're still, for their purposes of tracking the data, they're still counting loans that are past due, but in forbearance as delinquent, even though that delinquency doesn't directly show up on the credit score. But yeah, so those are delinquencies, and some are in forbearance and some are not. So it crosses both lines.
Right. Yeah. It's been a little bit hard to tell which is which, but it seems like the Black Knight number on, I know they have a number on loans that have gone delinquent that were current on March 1, and that number gone delinquent without getting a forbearance, and that number is about 500,000. I don't know how many were stacked up before then that were already delinquent and did not subsequently get a forbearance. But that number would be interesting to see, because it does seem like a lot of the forbearances, well, we see people coming out of forbearance now and going straight back into delinquency. If that's a problem the servicers can solve if they get on it. Whereas it's been a harder problem to solve the people who have never come into the forbearance system.
Yeah, and I believe those numbers, yeah, that's something that we definitely carefully look at as well. Kind of those overlapping pools of forbearance and delinquency, but I believe they have said about 90% of post-pandemic delinquencies are in forbearance, whereas on the flip side, about 40%, only about 40% of pre-COVID delinquencies are in forbearance, but it's a much smaller number. So it is, to the point I know you've made to me in the past, Julie, is that not, even with these widespread forbearance programs, not everybody is in forbearance. Even folks who went delinquent after COVID, there's still 10% of them who are not taking advantage of that forbearance program.
Great. A couple additional questions we've got. First one is, beyond your point about trends in smaller mid-sized cities, are there particular regions where you would forecast an increase in foreclosure over the next several years?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first thought is on the FHA trend that I was talking about. Areas that have a high percentage of FHA loans are going to be more susceptible to higher foreclosure rates over the next few years. I think there is a little bit of something with the city thing. I don't think that's necessary. I think that's a little bit more of a knee-jerk reaction. Remains to be seen. I mean, the work from home is a bigger trend than just, the two things I see that are pushing that trend are the work from home, and then the concerns around densely populated areas and the health concerns around that. But anyway, so I don't necessarily think cities per se, but I think the longer term trend where we could see higher foreclosure rates are in areas that people had already been leaving, which were the higher cost, higher not property tax necessarily, but higher tax, higher cost coastal markets.
Perfect. Last question. Does your data on REO peaks in 2024 take into account any state-by-state timelines around foreclosure completion? So judicial versus non-judicial states.
No, it does not at this point, but that is the next step in our exercise, is to start digging down to the state level. That was more of a broad brush at the national level. Now, we did try to be pretty conservative with our, conservative meaning longer delays. We're just going to expect more delays in the foreclosure process, but it is more of a blanket approach nationwide at this point. So maybe we can come back and share with you when we have a more state-focused approach to things.
Fantastic. Well, it goes without saying that we truly appreciate the upcoming partnership and your time today in sharing with us. I do see that one additional question came in, if you have just one more second.
Sure.
Given the anticipated increase in foreclosure inventory of the next few years, is a price decline expected like was experienced during the last market fall?
We do have baked into our forecast a slight price, I guess I would call it a slight price decline of about a cumulative price decline of 3% in 2021, and then another, I think, bigger price decline in 2022, 7%. So that is, and that affects home equity, so that does affect things. Yeah, so we do expect a price decline, but certainly, just to put that in context, during using the same data set during the Great Recession, nationwide, we saw a 30% price decline cumulatively. In some areas, as I'm sure you all know, it was much bigger than that.
Yeah.
Much bigger price decline.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again. As a reminder, we will make Daren's presentation available after the call today in the follow-up email. So we look forward to hearing from folks on any other questions they might have. At this point, I'm going to turn our call over to President Julia Gordon, and she will provide a policy update.
Thanks so much. And I just want to thank Daren again for a fantastic, very on-point presentation. And we hope we can have you back in a couple of months to see how things are evolving, because there's a lot still in play here, and we really appreciate getting the information. So, in fact, that is my segue into talking about policy. Clearly, the most important news that's happened in the since we last met is FHA and FHFA both extending their foreclosure moratoria. As I think everyone probably knows by now, they are extended through the end of the year. This, obviously is going to be a very significant headwind for those of us trying to provide inventory to developers. And it is, it solves a lot of problems for people, including concerns about evictions at present, as well as, frankly, solving, a political problem in kicking this can past the election season. My guess, though I'm no predictor, but my guess is it will not be extended past the end of December, regardless of who wins the November election. Again, just my view, all the caveats, but that's my feeling on that right now. A few other things, important developments we've seen lately. Yesterday, there was a bit of a surprise announcement coming out of the CDC, which does not typically opine on housing, where the CDC announced an eviction prohibition based on the imperatives of public health at this time. What is different about that prohibition than the eviction prohibition baked into the FHA and FHFA moratoria is it extends to all landlords, including single-family landlords, which FHFA doesn't cover right now. There are far more questions about this eviction prohibition than there are answers right now. It is not clear whether the CDC has the authority to do this. It's not clear how this would be implemented or enforced. There are lots of conversations going on around this, but it's important, especially for any of you who may be engaged in rental right now, if you have properties that you haven't been able to sell, you need to know that theoretically at this point, the CDC order applies to everybody. A few other things just to note on the policy front. One of the most important moving parts when it comes to access to credit is the FHFA capital rule, which says how much capital Fannie and Freddie have to hold. That proposed rule had comments due a couple of days ago. NCST did comment on that rule, frankly, virtually everybody else in the housing industry. Most of these comments were fairly negative about the rule as proposed, pointing out that the amount of capital that FHFA is talking about looks much more like bank capital requirements when for entities that are, monoline mortgage entities that are right now backstopped by the US government, that seems excessive and, will have an effect on price and credit availability that's going to be detrimental to a lot of Americans. So more details on that you'll be able to see in our newsletter coming out, I think, either late today or tomorrow morning. There is an upcoming comment deadline for comments to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau about the qualified mortgage definition. Again, very inside baseball, but extremely important when it comes to the availability of credit, particularly for LMI communities, for communities of color. And that is something to keep an eye on. As of now, we see no progress in Congress toward another COVID package. There had been some hope that something would be wrapped in with the fiscal cliff that we reach at the end of this month. Prognostication about that changes day to day. Both the House and Senate staff are continuing to work on housing-related provisions that might be included in that relief, chief among them being a rental assistance fund that would complement any kind of eviction prohibition by, making sure that actually tenants can continue to pay their rents, which is the best way to protect not just the tenants, but also the financial position of the landlords. On the regulatory front, we have seen FHA and FHFA extend the various COVID-related flexibilities, as well as put forward new and useful post-forbearance loss mitigation products, new loan modifications that can help a lot of people. For those of you in touch with borrowers, we've emphasized before, if a borrower is not in forbearance, they absolutely should get themselves in forbearance. There are no downsides to them from it. But for borrowers who may be reaching the end of a forbearance period, first, they do have the right to request a second forbearance period of another 6 months, but they have to request it. The servicers can't do it automatically. And second, if they get in touch with their servicer There are so many post-forbearance options right now that really most borrowers should be able to find a solution that brings them current and deals with their forbearance or arrearages. So people really should not be afraid of reaching out to their servicer on this. So I'm going to stop there. I know we're at 1:30, but I do want to open for questions in case anybody has any questions on the policy stuff.
Kevin, go ahead.
He's muted.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Julia, you did mention at this time, but I think it was seminar before last. Have you gotten any update to see if they will now allow the nonprofit organizations, if they're able to rehab a property so that they can enter into a new FHA contract prior to 91 days, or are we still stuck there?
Yeah, that is not on the sort of COVID priority list, and we're still stuck there. The regulators right now are very focused on the COVID related and forbearance related policy, and that's been sucking up all the time.
Additional questions from folks? You can either use the
So thanks again to Daren Blomquist, and thanks to everybody for coming, and happy new school year. I'm sure many of you, like me, have a child somewhere in the house at a desk on a Zoom, and we will talk to you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.